Peeps, today we're going to be talking about B-tanks. So peeps, today I wanted to talk about acetylene tanks or B-tanks, which is something we typically use as plumbers because I realized there are a couple of things you need to know about these things before getting ahead and starting the job and opening up the tank. A lot of times you see me on the job site and you see exactly as I did in the beginning of this video, which is like the B-tank, but there's a lot of things that come into play before you actually get to this point, and I wanted to take you through my mental checklist that I have to go through before I ever light my torch, because using a torch can be quite dangerous actually. Dad and I were on a job site recently and we ended up almost lighting a B-tank before going through the checklist correctly, and that's when I realized how crucial it is, because you can actually get yourself into a couple of different types of troubles, and I wanted to go through what those troubles are. I also wanted to show you the B-tank and what the functioning parts are on it so that you just are well acquainted before you get onto a job site with it. The first thing that you got to know is that this bad boy right here is the B-tank, and there's a few things that you need to note about it. First and foremost, in order to open up a B-tank, what you're gonna need is a special key. I keep this key right here on my person at all time. It is on my belt or on my keychain, and I do this for two specific reasons. It's because if I'm ever lighting the B-tank, I gotta take this off my belt, I gotta put the key onto the valve right here, and I have to rotate it counterclockwise. Now, I only do this about a quarter of a turn to a half turn, but I see a lot of people doing it a whole turn. It really depends on you, and I think the rule is that you're actually supposed to keep this on the B-tank at all times when it's in use. That way, if anything happens with the flame and you can't get it to stop, you come straight to the B-tank, the key's already ready, you crank it closed tight, and then there's no gas flowing through the hose. The reason why I keep this on my keys is because when I put this onto my tank and I open it up and I do some soldering and then I gotta run to the truck to go get something, I have to take this key back. It reminds me I have to close the tank and then I have to go to the truck. And the reason why I bring that up is because the last thing you want to do is leave an open tank on the job site ready to be used with any sort of flame. You would much rather close the tank before leaving. That way, if anybody with any sort of flame walks by, there's not going to be an accident where the tank accidentally lights on fire because, for example, maybe you left the hose a little bit open and you could hear the gas coming out. A lot of mess can happen because of that. So I keep it on my person at all time to make sure that if I'm going to the truck, I'm closing the tank all at the same time. Just to take you through what's going on the tank, the first thing you got to know is that the B-tank, when you get from your supplier, comes only with this part right here, which is the tank, and then this part right here as well. Everything you see from here to the left is something that you have to buy as a plumber. You have a hose here, you have a regulator. This regulator comes with a valve that tells you how much you have left. The tank is just about half full currently, and this regulator also comes with something called a flashback arrestor. The flashback arrestor stops the flame from retracting and going back into the tank. This is a crucial point right here. It's usually covered with some rubber or whatnot so that it's safe, but a flashback arrestor is so crucial because if the flame does somehow go backwards, this can get really bad, really hairy, really scary sort of thing. Those are the three functioning parts to it, and then when you travel down the hose, you'll come to the actual torch part. This is where you light the flame, and this is your regulator on the torch as well, which allows you to open and close, add more volume of gas or take away the volume of gas depending on how much flame you want. So this is a very small flame. If you're ever working with 50-50 and you have to cap pipes, you can bring your flame really low, and then if you're working with large diameter pipes, really high. Just quickly to show you, the regulator itself has a knob as well, which allows you to work on how much volume of gas you want coming into the hose at the same time. As you can see, you can rotate it just like so. All right, and normally what you have to do is you have a union right here. This union comes with your regulator. The tank is supplied with this piece right here. You just thread it onto it and you're good to go. So I wanted to take you through the checklist that I normally go through before lighting my torch, so you know exactly what's going through my mind, and that way you can learn from my experience as well. The very first thing that I ever do when I'm bringing the B-tank out is the first question you have to ask before even getting onto the job site is, do you have enough gas for the job? See, many years ago when I was really early on in my apprenticeship, my father and I had to do a very early job for a bunch of restaurants, and we had to go into the mechanical room that supplied a bunch of restaurants and do some soldering down there, and it's large diameter pipe. We're talking about 2-inch, 3-inch diameter copper pipe that we had to solder. Dad lights it up and he's soldering a bunch of joints, and then he realizes in the last joint he doesn't have enough gas inside the torch to heat up the fittings as high as he needs to heat them up. All of a sudden, we had to drop everything and go to the supplier and swap out a B tank. That's the very first question you have to ask. Do you have enough gas inside the tank in order to get the job done? A little bit of an interesting thing that my dad does is he actually carries 2 B tanks. He has one that he's using and he has a spare in his truck just in case the first one goes and he doesn't have enough gas. That way he can swap them out and he doesn't have to run to a supplier in order to do that. Make sure that when you're storing the B tanks though, that they're always stored in the upright position in a safe place. So that's the first thing. That's even before you get onto the job site. Now let's talk about the moment you open up your torch with your key. You turn it open, you leave the key on top of that. In case of an emergency, you can crank it and close the gas from getting into the hose. The very first question you have to ask yourself is there anything flammable or explosive nearby me? This is a question you ask right away before lighting your torch, obviously, right? As a service plumber myself, I'm constantly on the lookout for if I ever go into a washroom and I'm about to do soldering and I see any sort of aerosol cans that are hairspray or anything like that, I have to remove them from the situation to make sure that the flame doesn't get near them because they can explode. If you're ever working in a kitchen where people actually cook and actually eat, you're dealing with oils inside kitchens as well. It's something you got to be worried about. If any olive oil gets lit, it's going to be flaming for a while. You have to make sure that you know where the appropriate fire extinguisher is, etc. If you're ever dealing in a garage and you got to solder a hose bib, you got to be careful because lawnmower gas is usually inside a garage. A lot of people do oil changes. They also put gas into things inside their garage. So you got to be not only worried about the liquid, you also got to be worried about the fumes. There are a lot of fumes out there that are flammable in and of themselves, so that's something you got to be careful for. If you smell gas when you walk into a garage, the first thing that you have to do is you have to well ventilate the area, not only for the gasoline itself, but also for the acetylene coming out of your torch. You have to make sure that the gas is removed from the situation, the oil is removed from the situation, and if you aren't comfortable, do not ever light your torch. If you ever go into a body shop, sometimes you'll smell paint. A lot of body shops end up painting their trucks and cars afterwards. That's something you got to be careful of as well. If you see paint cans around, you got to move them or you got to explain to the owner, look, there's a little bit of a danger here. I'm lighting my torch. Let's move everything if we need to. Let's open up the garage door so we let the fumes out, for example. I remember a few years back on my birthday, I ended up getting an emergency call around 4 o'clock and somebody was putting in a countertop and they just installed the sink, but they realized that the sink doesn't go in because valves were in the way. They called me down and I'm sitting there and I'm about to light my torch and there's a gentleman wiping down, I think it was a granite countertop with something that smelled similar to paint thinner. Right away, just from the smell, I thought to myself, this smells flammable. I asked the gentleman, I go, is this flammable? He goes, yeah. I said, can you just stop for a second because I'm about to light my torch. Let's open up some windows. I don't want anything lighting on fire. And respectfully, everybody was on board. They were like, yeah, we don't want a flame inside this new home. Let's open up all the windows. I'll put the thinner away. Here's the thing that you got to realize with the torch. Most things are flammable. So that's something you got to keep in mind. Whenever you're working with the torch, you're constantly trying to process, is anything in my way that's going to light up? So for example, whenever I deal underneath the sink, if I'm ever soldering something, I'm always worried about supply lines. I'm always worried about the countertop itself. I'm always worried about the cabinet. You constantly have to be moving your torch in a way where you're trying to avoid a bunch of things happening. Flammability is something for the rest of your career you're going to be constantly encountered by and concerned about. So I'm not too worried about that. It's the explosive stuff that you have to be severely concerned about because it's not always on my mind because we don't always deal with it. Now that we got the first part out of the way where you assess the situation for dangerous things, you finally opened up your torch, here's the next question you have to ask yourself. Are there smoke detectors or fire alarms set up in this situation where it's going to call the fire station? And this is a big one for us plumbers that work in residential. Here's something you got to realize, that inside the units, most of the time, if you're dealing in residential, you do not have a fire alarm that's hooked up to the fire station. But inside the hallways, you do have fire alarms that are hooked up to the fire station. So God forbid those go off, then the fire station is actually sending a truck down to come see you. And they're going to be like, why did you light your torch? They're going to go through a bunch of questions. You're going to feel really uncomfortable. It's not something you really want to do. Here's something you got to realize. Before you light your torch inside a building, the first thing that you have to do is either talk to the superintendent or talk to the person in charge that hired you, and you have to ask them, are any of these alarms above my head hooked up to the fire station? Because if they are, the first thing you have to do is get that individual to call the monitoring station who monitors the fire alarms, and they're going to tell them, look, we have a plumber inside the building. He or she is going to be lighting their torch in a little bit. Maybe we should put the building on standby for a couple of hours. That way, if an alarm goes off, we're not bringing any fire trucks down. What you have to realize is if a fire truck comes to the building and you're the reason why it's happening, you are going to get charged. The company is going to get charged with a truck charge. And I think the fire station is like a couple of $1,000s per truck. It's something you really want to avoid and your boss really wants to avoid. That's why it's so crucial. Right before you're about to light your torch, you have to ask, are any of these fire alarms going to bring fire trucks? Now you've got all the questions out of the way. Do you have enough gas? Sure. Did you remove any flammable or combustible materials from your situation? Yes. Are there any fumes that are currently a problem? No. Perfect. Will you set off a fire alarm that will bring the fire truck? No. Then you are finally in a position to light your torch and then continue with the soldering. Peeps, the reason why I bring this conversation up is because there have been a couple of close calls in my career, and knock on wood, I'm sure at some point you'll forget and you might have a close call yourself. But the reason why I bring this up is so you know there's a lot going into opening up a torch and lighting a flame. You shouldn't take it lightly. You should consider it a very big responsibility because a lot of bad things can happen. And that's why we have this checklist in our heads so that we make sure that we have everything checked off and then we can go ahead and commence the work that we need to do. So peeps, I hope you like this topic. Let me know in the comments below if you've had any close calls or if there are any other rules in your checklist that maybe I should add to mine. Practice plumbing safely, and I'll see you guys very soon. Kenny Molotov, guys. Peace, baby.